time ago that I couldn't live in places like London. I needed to be in the mountains next to the sea, and the only real place to do that was North Wales. But I'll get back to that in a moment. Really, where we have to start with my journey is the very beginning. And that very beginning, in this particular case, is the very beginning of life on Earth, and particularly the very beginning of photosynthesizing plants. I want you to imagine something. I want you to imagine that you've pulled out a tape measure to 5 meters. And if you think that every millimeter on that tape measure is 100,000 years, which means that every centimeter on that tape measure is 1,000,000 years. So a meter is 100 million years, and then your 5 meter tape measure is 500 million years. Well, photosynthesizing plants first evolved, we think, our hypothesis is that they evolved 1,500 million years ago. And it was at that point in time that we got to the stage where the carbon in our atmosphere and fresh water started to really kind of change. Those photosynthesizing plants started to pump oxygen into our atmosphere and started to create an environment that was suitable, more suitable for all life on Earth. And that's, to me, quite an incredible thing. Going back to our kind of tape measure timeline, the very first land plants crept onto land, and they probably looked very similar to something like algae, but eventually they kind of formed kind of multicellular land plants that looked very similar to things like liverworts and mosses. And we know that liverworts and mosses were around very early, and that happened at about 475-ish million years ago. So we're on our 5 meter timeline already. So we're at 4 meters 75 on that timeline. And those land plants coming onto land, they made a really big step change for life on Earth. They really started to change the atmosphere of this planet, but they also started to do something which was to create soils, to create organic soils, soils rich in nitrogen. So they had a huge impact, and they allowed for life on land really to kind of get going. The first vascular plants, the plants that have xylem and phloem, the tubes that allow them to get water and other nutrients around their body, evolved about 55 million years later. So, you know, really quite a long time after the very first plants crept out of the water and onto the land. And this particular land plant is one called Cooksonia pertonii. It is known from rocks here in Wales as well as in Scotland, and those rocks are early Silurian in origin, so around about the kind of 425 to 400 million year mark. So that's 4 meters on our timeline. There's our timeline. And you can see I've marked on there where those kind of early land plants came in, the bryophytes, at that 475 million years mark, and Cooksonia there at 425-ish million years. And we can see where all of those other things have happened, those amazing things that we first think of when we're thinking about deep time. Things like when the dinosaurs were around, when the first amphibians were around, when we had giant dragonflies flying around the forests, and when bees first evolved, things like that. So it gives you an idea of, you know, where these plants sit in the history of life on Earth. But of course, there is another very beginning, and that is the very beginning of my journey trying to understand the history of life on Earth. As a very small boy, I was absolutely fascinated by all kinds of life. For me, the idea of evolution really kind of blew my mind. The fact that endless diversity that we have on this planet created endless possibility as well, which, you know, that's something that's very, very special. And so as a young boy, I actually looked very like Christopher Robin. As a young boy, I was constantly lifting rocks. I was what my mum and dad called skiddling in the pond. In fact, they couldn't keep me away from the pond. We had a big garden. I grew up in an amazing garden, actually. It was one of those kind of in between the wars, 1930s kind of Barratt homes. But it was, my grandmother had bought the show home, so it was the biggest one in the plot. And in her plot, she had a monkey puzzle tree. It was a huge monkey puzzle tree. And when I, as a 10-year-old boy, discovered that the monkey puzzle tree had been on this earth almost unchanged since the time of the dinosaurs, can you imagine what that did to my child's mind? Both of my brothers were looking at dinosaur books and playing with dinosaurs, and all of a sudden I stopped seeing those dinosaurs. All I could see was the plants that had been depicted by the paleo artists in those dinosaur books in the background. They were never really in any great detail. Those plants were kind of generally kind of like a monkey puzzle tree or like a fern or something like that. And so I got absolutely absorbed by the idea that there were still plants on this planet that had been around for such a long time. And I had one growing in my garden. Outside my bedroom window, there was this huge monkey puzzle tree that collared doves bred in. It created all kinds of problems in the garden because of the amount of shade it cast, the needles that it dropped, and the fact that it made the turf underneath it completely bone dry in summer. And my mum and dad really wanted to get rid of it, except it had a TPO on it and they couldn't, which pleased me in no end. And the Araucariaceae, as you can see on the timeline here, they actually evolved before the first amphibians evolved, which for me is an incredible thing. You know, something that is still around now evolved before the first amphibians. And we think of amphibians as being some of that first life that crept onto land, but that's in a kind of an alternative way of thinking where we only think about the moving things, the animals and the birds and what have you, whereas actually the plants had been around creating an environment suitable for all of those other things to live in. Fast forward now quite some time to 10 years ago, and this is what Snowdonia looked like 10 years ago, around about January when I took this photo. And my partner, who was at the time living in London, I was living up here, and I decided to buy a house. and we decided that the only place that we could buy a house was as near to the mountains as we could possibly get. And if it had some water next to it, even better. So where better to put our roots down than Llanberis? And that's where we found our home. This is our garden. A couple of days after we bought it from the Google Earth Maps, you can see the garden that we bought had absolutely nothing in it. It was a lawn. In fact, it wasn't even a lawn. It was absolutely full of moss. And for me, seeing all that moss pleased me no end. I thought to myself, brilliant, I'm going to move to a place where I can grow moss. The first day we moved into the house, we went down to the garden centre to buy a hanging basket to let people know that we were actually going to be living in the house, not just buying it as a holiday cottage. One of my previous jobs had been as a male model, and my boyfriend, Ben, worked in a large investment bank, admittedly not as a banker, in the city in London. And so there was a bit of a rumor that got around the village that a investment banker and his model boyfriend were moving into, or had bought a house in the village, and they were going to be using it as a holiday home. And I didn't really want that. I desperately needed to make sure that I came here and was part of the village. So we went down to buy a hanging basket, and what we actually came home with was a Wollemi pine. For anybody that doesn't know about Wollemi pines, they have been on this planet for about 250 million years. Yet they were only discovered as living plants in 1994. A man called David Noble was in the Wollemi National Park, and he was gorge scrambling, and he went into a gorge and he found some trees that he didn't know what they were. He took a sample of the tree back to the office. No one in the office knew. It ended up at the Sydney Herbarium. They didn't know, and then a paleobotanist said, I know that tree. We have fossils of that tree. And there were only about 100 of these trees left in those gorges in the Wollemi National Park. And in order to protect them, they took quite an unusual step. Instead of just shutting them off, which they have actually done to protect them from disease, they brought some of them into cultivation, and they started propagating them and selling them in order to pay for the conservation of the species, which is quite a novel approach for plant conservation or any kind of conservation. And we were very lucky to have been able to buy one. That, and the fact that I had a huge collection of ferns at my mum and dad's house, started the idea of us growing a fossil garden. My mum wasn't best impressed when I told her that I was going to be digging up her entire garden of ferns and bringing them here to Llanberis. She was left with a pretty blank space. It took her a little while to get her head around the fact that she basically wasn't going to have that lovely garden anymore. But once she got her head around it, she realized that she was going to actually be able to have the bright, colourful garden that she really wanted now, and the ferns were going to be better here with us in Llanberis. That's where the first ferns evolved, so not that long after the Wollemi, after the Araucariaceae, which the Wollemi pine and the monkey puzzle tree belong to. So, you know, ferns have been around for quite a long time. Of course, the Araucariaceae produce seeds, and ferns produce spores. Another group of plants that produce seeds that have been around for a significant period of time like that are the cycads. And as soon as we had decided to produce a garden that was entirely made up of plants that had been around or their relatives for this length of time, and it's very important that I say that most of the plants in the garden aren't actually exactly the same as the plants that we find in the fossil record. They are very closely related, but we can't be sure that they're exactly the same, because the fossil record doesn't capture all that minute detail that taxonomists use to describe a plant. So we've got a good idea what the plants in the fossil record look like, but we've not got an accurate idea. And so we never, it's very rare that we'll call a plant from the fossil record the same thing as a plant that's around today, but they're normally very similar. And cycads are in that exact situation. When we first decided that we were going to have this garden full of fossil plants, we started growing cycads. Cycads seemed the most obvious choice of plants. And of course, living in Llanberis, we had just had 2 very cold winters. We didn't know when the next very cold winter was coming. We wanted to try and grow the hardiest cycad species that we could grow. And so in order to get those things, and cycads are very threatened in the wild, in fact, they're the most threatened group of organisms on the planet. We didn't want to go buying big cycad plants that might have been dug up out of the wild. We wanted to ensure that we were going to do what we were doing ethically. And so we started growing cycads from seed. And believe me, growing a cycad from seed is not like growing any other seed. It's more like incubation than germination. You keep them in little humid, warm bags, and you turn the seed on a regular basis to make sure that it's evenly moist all over. And eventually they put out a root, and you have to look after them with kid gloves while they're putting out their first root. And then it might be a whole year or 2 before they put out their first leaf, which is quite an incredible process. That's where the first cycads evolved on the planet, a bit before dinosaurs. In fact, a significant bit before dinosaurs, at 300 million years ago. Another plant that's really very famous for being a fossil plant is Ginkgo biloba. During the Jurassic period, the ginkgophytes, the ginkgo family, was actually really huge. There was lots and lots of different species of ginkgo, and in this neck of the woods, or as it would have been back then, there was a species of ginkgo called Ginkgo huttonii. But nowadays, we only have 1 species of ginkgo on this planet, and that's Ginkgo biloba, which originally comes from China. It may or may not still be a wild plant species. It was looked after, the tiny remnant population of it that was left was looked after by Chinese monks. And they really saved this species from extinction by revering it for its medicinal qualities and its beauty. And so it's another case of where horticulture has helped plants evade extinction. So we've got the Wollemi pine, cycads, and Ginkgo biloba, all very, very threatened in the wild, but being looked after through horticulture. There's the first ginkgos on the timeline. Again, a little bit before the dinosaurs there. And of course, we could have stuck with that. We could have just had a garden full of ferns and ginkgo and Wollemi pines and monkey puzzle tree and all of these wonderful green things, which would have been very simple, except Ben really wanted flowers. And I knew that flowers had evolved during the time of the dinosaurs. But of course, where do you start? Where do you start finding out which flowers that you can garden, that you can grow in a garden that has such strict limits on it? So we're talking about a garden that we only grow plants in the actual garden here in Llanberis that have a fossil record from before the extinction of the dinosaurs. That's 66 million years ago. So everything from that 475, 450 million years ago, all the way up to 66 million years ago. And after that point, I mean, we do grow some, but in the actual garden itself, we grow these plants that are related to those ones with the fossil record before that point. And so how do you go about finding them? Well, the way that we went about doing it was we started looking at phylogenies. So phylogenies are effectively the family tree of life on Earth. They are extensions, the ends of the branches of Darwin's tree of life. And they tell the story of how organisms are related to one another. And historically, we would have done that with morphology, so that the study of understanding the different features that allow us to realize whether something's closely related to another thing or not. But nowadays, more and more, we're able to do it with understanding the genetic diversity by looking at the genes of things and understanding how things are related to one another that way. And the best way to do it is to use a combination of both techniques. So we started looking at these phylogenies in order to start to understand how long ago it was different groups of flowering plants had evolved, and whether they might have evolved before that 66 million year cutoff point. So this is a phylogeny of all of the flowering plants, and a group of plants that I really love is the Ericaceae, the family that includes rhododendrons, heathers, blueberries and bilberries, and a whole bunch of other plant species. In fact, it's about the 14th largest plant family. And I absolutely adore the Ericaceae. And I really wanted to know if amongst all those flowering plants, if there was a member of the Ericaceae that had a fossil record that pre-existed the 66 million year cutoff point. And there's the Ericaceae where that arrow is pointing to. And what I found was that, yes, there was a member of the Ericaceae that, or a genus within the Ericaceae that did pre-exist that 66 million year cutoff point. It was a genus called Enkianthus, and what you can see here is the phylogeny, or a simplified phylogeny of the Ericaceae, and that section of the Ericaceae, the Enkianthoidae, that sits basally to all of the other members of the Ericaceae family. And so by finding out the basal lineages, so that those early groups in each of the plant families, we were able to then use that to go and check to see if there was a fossil record of those very early groups. And in this particular case, we found a fossil called Paleoenkianthus, which is the fossil that you can see there. And you can see from the seed pods of modern day Enkianthus and looking at Paleoenkianthus, they're actually very similar to modern day Ericaceae or modern day Enkianthus. So I was really, really pleased that I was going to be able to grow Enkianthus in the garden here. And they are exquisite little little bell-shaped flowers on shrubs and small trees. And Actually, when I did more research into it, I found that there were other members of the Ericaceae that I was able to grow in the garden here. But of course, it's not all pollination, which is something that the flowering plants are very well known for being linked to, you know, this idea of flowers need bees and bees need flowers. That idea of pollination didn't start with the flowering plants. It actually started with a group of plants called in the gymnosperms, or in the same group of plants as the pines and the cycads, during the Jurassic, in this amazing group of plants called the knee-tails. And I set off on a journey that I needed to grow some knee-tails in the garden. I wanted really to be able to grow this plant, Welwitschia mirabilis, from Namibia. And of course, there was no way I was going to be growing a Welwitschia in a garden in Llanberis. But what I could do was grow this plant. This is Ephedra fominea, or from a group of plants, family of plants called the Ephedraceae. And Ephedra is very closely related to Welwitschia. It does an amazing thing where it only opens its cones during a full moon. And that's because it needs that full moon to show itself off to its best for its pollinators, which are bugs and beetles and flies and moths. And so the idea of a plant that only opens its cones on a full moon to attract its pollinators was absolutely fascinating to me. So I wanted to grow as many species of Ephedra as I possibly can in the garden. We have quite a few. Ben, however, wasn't buying it. He was like, no, they're not flowers. They're still just cone-bearing plants. I need flowers. So that's where the Nitopsida, or the family that includes the Ephedras and Welwitschia, evolved on our timeline. So then I started looking at the basal lineages in the flowering plants. And of course, that led me down another little rabbit hole. And I found that actually we had some of those really, really very early basal flowering plants still around today. We had water lilies. Water lilies are one of the earliest flowering plant groups to have evolved, and they're still around today. Incidentally, water lilies evolved at about the same time as this wonderful four-leafed clover fern in the picture. Four-leaf, you wouldn't believe that there's a fern called a four-leaf clover fern and that it's completely aquatic. This plant is another one of those basal angiosperms. This is Illicium simonsi. It's very closely related to star anise, Illicium verum. And that flavor combination that we get from Illicium verum is a whole bunch of toxins that probably were evolved in order to ward off some pretty hefty predators. When these things evolved, the things that were grazing them were dinosaurs. So no wonder they've got some hefty chemicals inside them that make them very tasty for us. In fact, most species of Illicium are actually quite poisonous for us, but certainly make them very poisonous if you happen to be a dinosaur. This is another great group of plants, and probably one of the most successful groups of flowering plants during the Cretaceous period when the dinosaurs were around. It's called Chloranthus, or the Chloranthaceae, and there's another genus in the same family called Sarcandra. And when I discovered these, I was just mind blown. All of a sudden, there was this huge diversity of flowering plants that was opening up to us to grow in our garden. And there's a lot of talk about the magnolias being a group of plants that were around with the dinosaurs. However, that's not strictly true. Actually, there's only two groups of magnolias that were actually around before that 66 million year ago point. One is this group, the Liriodendrons. So this is Liriodendron chinensis and Liriodendron tulipifera, both growing in our garden. One comes from China, one comes from North America, and historically they had a distribution that went all over the northern hemisphere of the world, all over a continent called Laurasia that used to make up, that was made up of Asia, Europe, and North America. So there are Liriodendron fossils from Great Britain and Russia and China and the USA, as well as a little bit further south. And that idea of historic distribution of plants is almost as fascinating as the plants themselves. Paleogeography, or the paleobotany of paleogeography, is very interesting, and it allowed some of the earliest theories of continental movement to be formed. This is another of those very early fossil plants, Chimonanthus or winter sweet, we grow in our garden. It's absolutely heavenly scented about now. And it has fossil relatives called Jerseyanthus and Virginianthus from the USA. And Sassafras albidum, another one that we grow in our garden. And there's the fossil of Sassafras albidum, which I absolutely find that incredible, that something can be seen from a fossil that's nearly 75 million years old and around today. And this strange thing is a pipe vine. This is Aristolochia curbitifolia, and the piper ales are another group that we grow in our garden that we find absolutely fascinating. They're quite closely related in the grand scheme of things to the magnolias, and interestingly, they have their floral parts in whorls of 3. So this is another member of the piper ales, Anemopsis from the USA. And it doesn't, those aren't petals, those are floral bracts, which is exactly the same thing as the petals that you see in magnolia. So that you can start to see the kind of links between magnolia and the piper ales through this species. And then you get this wonderful little plant. This is Seruma henryi, and you can see those floral parts in whorls of 3. And in the other members of the piper ales and the magnolids, the petals aren't petals, they're tepals or floral bracts. Whereas in this plant, actually those are real petals. And there are fossils of plants very similar to this from the time of the dinosaurs. So I find this plant a wonderful example of that kind of evolution right before our very eyes. And another group of plants that has their floral parts in the whorls of 3 is the monocots. So all of this section in green are monocots. So that's things like palm trees and grasses and yams, lilies, gingers are all monocots. And there are species of monocot around today that have been around, like all those other things, for a significant period of time. This is Orontium aquaticum, and it has 2 fossil relatives that have been around since the Cretaceous. You can see from this picture of Arestio that the graminids, the grasses and their relatives have their floral parts in whorls of 3. And then So we've got a whole bunch of monocots in the garden, but then there's another group of flowering plants called the dicots or the eudicots that they produce 2 seed leaves as opposed to 1 seed leaf in the monocots. And there's a basal group of them, which nearly all have a fossil records from before the extinction of the dinosaurs. So you can see we're still following that phylogenetic tree of the flowering plants here. And so during our process of creating the garden, every time we wanted to find something out, we went back to this tree of life to understand when things had evolved and used that work of taxonomists to understand whether we could grow those plants in the garden or not. This plant, this fossil from 125 million years ago, is one of the earliest fossil angiosperms or flowering plants that we know. It's called Leaf fructus, and it has a very close modern relative in the form of Coptis, which is very closely related to the buttercups. And so, of course, we grow Coptis in the garden. And Glaucidium, which is one of the, that's the basal lineage in the poppy family. So poppies had evolved during the Cretaceous, during this kind of mass explosion of the flowering plants. We grow Sarcococca hookeriana right next to our front door. Its common name is postman's friend. And that's because at this time of year when everything's freezing cold and it's not very nice for postmen to be out doing their job, this thing is smelling absolutely heavenly. So when they come to our front door, actually our postman has commented on the smell of the Sarcococca in the winter on a few occasions now. But there was a point where we realized that a lot of the plants that we were growing were actually big trees. We had to draw a line somewhere. One of those lines that we drew was Platanus. Platanus is known very well from its fossil record from the time of the dinosaurs. And there's just no way that we can grow a platanus or a plane tree in our garden here. We had so many big trees, and the garden is 115 square meters in size at the back of a Welsh terraced cottage, a little slateman's cottage here in Llanberis. But very closely related to platanus is the sacred lotus. Could we grow sacred lotus in our garden? Well, we tried and we succeeded. We have a beautiful tub of sacred lotus growing in our back garden. Admittedly, it's a species, a form of a species that grows as far north as Russia. So it gets pretty cold in the winter up there where that form grows. But yep, we can grow Nelumbo. And that's a member of a plant family called the Proteales, or a group of plants called the Proteales. And that is us kind of really reaching maximum glamour in the garden. The Proteales, or actually a particular family within the Proteales called the Proteaceae, are one of the best examples of what's known as the Antarctic or Gondwanan flora. And they are found on every single one of the land masses that covers what was the supercontinent Gondwana, now forms all of the southern hemisphere land masses, South America, South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, and Antarctica. And it was really at the point that we got there that we kind of said, that's it. We found exactly where this whole project was going. Because what we had found was a plant family that had been around for the right length of time, that had such huge diversity, about 1,000 500 different species. And we wanted to grow them. They were all of the things that we really wanted to grow in the garden. They ticked all the boxes. After all that time, this is what the garden looked like. Actually, that Wollemi pine is now somewhere in the region of 9 meters tall. And this garden had gone from having nothing in it to having around about 1,000 species of plants in 115 square meters, which had by this point attracted quite a lot of attention. And Ben and I really knew that we didn't want our little garden with such diversity to be of no use to the world. We needed it to be a garden that was there and available for use. This story of evolution and the plants that we were growing that told that story could be used by the world. A lot of them were threatened with extinction. And so we joined an organization called BGCI and subsequently became an accredited botanic garden. So 115 square meters at the back of a little terrace cottage in Llanberis in Snowdonia is all of a sudden an accredited botanic garden working for plant conservation and science on a world scale, which for me seems quite incredible. In fact, it's mind-blowing that we've been able to take our back garden and turn it into something that is so useful for conservation and the planet. We now don't just work with the plants that we have in our garden. This is a plant that I'm working with at the moment. There are, in fact, in this photo, you are seeing the entire wild population of this plant species. This is Maimetes stokoi, and no one knows how to germinate Maimetes stokoi. I have managed to germinate one once. I've been able to germinate a very close relative of it. And I use my horticultural skills and the things that I've learned during all of that time now to help to understand how we can best protect species like this. This is a member of the Proteaceae from South Africa. This is another member of the genus Maimetes. I've managed to germinate a couple of plants of Maimetes arboreus and one of only 2 people that has ever germinated a silver-leaved Maimetes. And all of that stuff that we do in and trying to understand how to germinate and grow these things, we write down, we have databases, and we make sure that it's published in so that other people in the future can do that. I think it's very important that because I'm interested in evolution, not just that deep time evolution, I'm interested in the diversity that we have on the planet today. And one group of plants that we can see evolving right before our eyes is the genus Iris, and particularly the group of Iris in the Eastern Mediterranean called Onchocyclus. And most species of Onchocyclus are threatened with extinction. This one, Iris atropopurea, will be the first species of iris to become extinct in the Eastern Mediterranean. And that's because its entire habitat is currently being built on. And I can't use my skills only for plant species from elsewhere in the world. I think it's very important that we look after the things on our doorstep as well as the things that are far away. And so we now have conservation collections here as part of our nursery, our conservation research nursery that we opened about five or 6 years ago, of some of Snowdonia's rarest Arctic alpines. So we are very proud to have one of the only living collections ex situ, so in cultivation, collections of the tufted saxifrage, in cultivation, the tufted saxifrage from Cwmidwell. There are 8 plants of tufted saxifrage in the whole of Wales in the wild, and we have about 15 of them at the nursery, which hopefully one day will be used to bolster the wild populations in Cwmidwell. So that's another area where we're using our horticultural skills and my background in conservation to help a plant species, but this time right on our doorstep. And we also get involved in all kinds of other projects to help plants in and around North Wales. This is Caerddol. This is a meadow restoration project that we instigated about 7 years ago as well. And we've taken Caerddol from a heavily sheep and horse grazed field that had only about 8 vascular plant species per square metre to a flourishing meadow that has about 30 flowering plant species per square metre during that 7-year period. It's also a wonderful place to hang out, and people in the summer absolutely adore being down on Caerddol. And so that's that. I know I'm a little bit over time. I'm sorry about that. But Claire.
Oh, thank you so much, Robbie. Diolch yn fawr. Just amazing talk there about, you know, these ancient plants and trees, and so exciting to think that you've got all those species just in a little patch in Llanberis, but that you're also doing your bit for, you know, the native species here in Snowdonia with the tufted saxifrage, and taking after those Chinese monks that helped to save the ginkgo. If anyone's got any questions, could you please type them in the chat box and I'll read them out to Robbie. I've got a question actually. I just wasn't sure, how did the ginkgo nearly go extinct? You said there was...
So what tends to happen with these kind of relics from ancient times is that they've evolved to a point, and when the world changes around them, sometimes they can't kind of, you know, they've reached the pinnacle of their evolution. They might only change just a little bit from there on in, and the world changes around them, and that might be that the climate changes, or the geology changes, or currently we're chopping forests down at a rate that is causing a greater mass extinction event than has ever happened before. And so you get these species that just kind of, they hang on. And so like the Wollemi pine in its gorges, and the ginkgo in its, actually that's a gorge as well in China. Glaciations happen, and all of these things happen around them, and they just hang on. And it might be that they get down to a very small number. And those monks, in the case of the ginkgo, found that very small number, realized that they were incredibly beautiful, and realized that the seed was actually very good for them, or the fruit was very good for them. And so they kind of realized that they had to look after this very small number of plants. But, you know, there's so many pressures on plants, and those are the things that cause them to evolve. But they're also the same set of pressures that cause extinctions. Unfortunately, what's happening at the moment is that those pressures are so great that the plants aren't able to evolve alongside them quick enough. And so the extinctions are happening too quickly.
Yeah. Diolch. We've got a question from John Harold, our director. Are you going to be involved with the Natur am Byth project on Arctic alpines in Eryri?
Thanks, John. I've actually already been advising on that to a considerable extent. So I'm really, really pleased to see Natur am Byth happening, particularly for the Arctic alpines, but also for a whole suite of species across the Llyn and Ynys Môn. So a lot of those species I already grow. So one species on Anismorn, two species on Anismorn, the spotted rock rose and Juncus capitatus, we already grow at the nursery. So we're using the plants that we already grow to help the Llanberis project. And then the Saxifragus espitosas, our Saxifragus espitosas, will form part of the project as well. So long answer, but the short answer is absolutely yes.
Great. For those of you that aren't sure about where the chat box is, so we haven't had any other questions come in, if you go to the bar at the top or the bottom of your screen, you should see the chat box icon. We've got another one from Shan Turner. You mentioned drawing the line at planting platanus. I was already wondering about your Liriodendron. How will you manage that as it gets larger? Sorry.
The great thing about Liriodendron is that it can be pollarded and coppiced. So we already do kind of manage the big trees in the garden, but Liriodendron does this amazing thing where if you pollard it or coppice it, it just puts on these amazing growths with huge leaves, which are even more spectacular than the leaves that it has if you leave it to grow normally. So we do manage the trees. We are in no shadow of a doubt that there will come a time when some of these plants are going to have to find new homes. And actually what we tend to do is look at the garden as a moving feast. So when something is getting a bit too big for its boots, or maybe just isn't suitable, we will dig it up, give it to a friend. We've got a great friend that's got a 10-acre garden, so she takes a lot of stuff, or we give it to botanic gardens elsewhere in the country. So some of the rarer things nearly always go to a botanic garden.
Wonderful. From Paul Nixon, the North Wales Wildlife Trust has a meadows and habitats group. When lockdown allows, there's been a programme of visits. Could we visit Caerdydd and indeed your garden?
Absolutely.
Yeah, we had actually planned a Cymdeithas Snowdonia Society trip with Robbie to take us around Caerdydd. So that was in the programme. We'll definitely be
for anyone that doesn't know where Caerdydd is, when you look at that wonderful view of Snowdonia from Penllyn, basically Caerdydd sits in the middle of that view. So at the other end of the lake, it's the floodplain, and part of it's sheep grazed and part of it is managed as a meadow, and we're the part of it that's managed as a meadow.
Brilliant. That's the last of the questions so far. So unless anyone types something in, I'll say diolch yn fawr iawn, Robbie. Thank you so much on behalf of the Snowdonia Society for your fascinating talk. And yeah, it's great. So we're so lucky to have you just on the doorstep. And thank you also to our members for helping us through this hard time and allowing us to put on programs of talks like this. Yeah. So
thank you, Snowdonia Society, for everything that you do for Snowdonia.
Oh, diolch.
Because I love it.
You're right. Yeah, we really are lucky we've got the sea and the mountains. It's quite rare to have both so close together.
Nigel Brown, the Vice County Recorder from Anglesey, Nigel Brown of Treborth Botanic Gardens fame. Every year I help Nigel, or not last year, of course, and probably not this year again, but we have a group of students that come from the Royal Botanic Gardens queue and spend a week here in North Wales with us. And the reason why we bring them all the way up here from London is because this region of North Wales is one of the best places to show them every habitat type, from high Arctic tundra all the way down to salt marsh and seagrass meadow, and every type of habitat in between. We can do rainforest, we can do floristically diverse meadow, we can do shrubland, we can do the whole lot. So for their ecology week, they come to North Wales, and that's what makes North Wales so very special.
Yeah, long may that continue. We've got a thanks Robbie brilliant in the chat box, so
thanks Paul,
thumbs up. Okay, I'll wrap it up there. This will be available online, so we've been recording this evening, so for those of you who missed it or who came a bit late, there were a couple of people. So iawn, nos da pawb, diolch yn fawr. Thank you, Robbie.